You think Africa is free from foreign control? Think again. France's grip on Africa is more extensive than you probably realize. Join me as we investigate the ways in which France still controls its former African colonies. Welcome to The Seeker's Edge, where we seek knowledge that'll give you an edge in life. The French started their colonization of Africa in Senegal in the early 17th century. The presence of France in Senegal was limited to a trading post on the island of Gorée, a narrow strip on the coast in the town of St. Louis, and a handful of trading posts in the interior. In 1854, Napoleon III named an enterprising French officer, Louis Faidherbe, to govern and expand the colony, and to give it the beginning of a modern economy. Faidherbe built a series of forts along the Senegal River, formed alliances with leaders in the interior, and sent expeditions against those who resisted French rule. He built a new port at Dakar, established and protected telegraph lines and roads, followed these with a rail line between Dakar and St. Louis and another into the interior. He built schools, bridges, and systems to supply fresh water to the towns. He also introduced the large-scale cultivation of Bambara groundnuts and peanuts as a commercial crop. Reaching into the Niger Valley, Senegal became the primary French base in West Africa and a model colony. Dakar became one of the most important cities to the French Empire and of Africa. By 1930, French colonial Africa encompassed the vast confederations of French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa, the Western Maghreb and the Indian Ocean's islands of Madagascar, Réunion and the Comoros, and the Djibouti and the Horn of Africa. Within this African empire, territories in sub-Saharan Africa were treated primarily as colonies to exploit. By the end of 1960, the African countries under French control regained their freedom. The Central African Republic, Chad, Congo, Gabon, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali all became independent nations. However, France's control and influence remained in the African continent, mainly through the CFA Franc currency system. The currency system was established in 1945 as a part of the Bretton Woods Agreement, which aimed to promote international monetary cooperation and establish a stable global finance system. The CFA Franc was initially used in French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa, and was later adopted by other African countries. The CFA Franc has two different versions, the West African CFA Franc and the Central African CFA Franc. Both versions are backed by the French Treasury, and their exchange rates are fixed to the euro, which means that the value of the CFA Franc is determined by the value of the euro, which in turn is influenced by the economic performance of the Eurozone. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the history and background of the CFA Franc currency system, as well as the arguments for and against its continued use. Before the arrival of European colonizers in Africa, different societies on the continent had their own unique monetary systems. One of the widely used mediums of exchange was the cavalry seashell, which was commonly found along the West African coast. These seashells were used as currency in many West African societies, including the Akan people of present-day Ghana, the Efik of Nigeria, and the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria. The cavalry seashell was used as a form of currency for a variety of transactions, including buying and selling goods and services, paying dowries, and settling disputes. The shells were valued based on their size, shape, and quality, and were often strung together in long chains. However, with the arrival of European colonizers in Africa, new currencies were introduced to the continent. The French currency, known as the franc, was introduced to the region through French colonization. The CFA franc, a currency used by many francophone countries in West and Central Africa today, has its origins in the French franc. In 1800, the official exchange rate between the cavalry seashell and the French currency was set at 200 seashells to 1 franc. However, as European colonization spread across Africa, the use of traditional African currencies like the cavalry seashell declined, and the French franc became the dominant currency in many parts of the continent. With the introduction of the new currency, France sought to monopolize the production and trade circuits in Africa, and as part of this strategy, they introduced taxes that could only be paid in French francs. African markets were also subjected to the presence of armed French troops to enforce French economic interests. In the 1930s, France introduced the CFA, Communauté Financière Africaine franc, which replaced the previous franc. The new currency was adopted by French-speaking African colonies, including Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo-Brazzaville, Côte d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. The CFA franc was initially pegged to the French franc at a fixed rate, and then later to the euro in 1999. The French government retains control over the CFA franc's value, and the Central Bank of West African States and the Central African States Bank and issues the currency. However, the banks are required to deposit at least 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in France's treasury. This requirement limits the amount of money that African countries can spend in their own development and puts control of their finances in the hands of the French government. With the CFA Franc, the French basically control the African economies, and they've abused its power throughout history. After World War II, France was in need of rebuilding its economy, and to do so, it turned to its colonies in Africa. Initially, the exchange rate between the CFA franc and the French franc was set at 1-to-1. However, in 1948, the rate was adjusted to 50 CFA francs and 1 French franc. This devaluation made French exports cheaper, while also making imports from Africa more expensive. The devaluation made it easier for France to control the economy of its African colonies. To maintain control over the CFA franc, France established its franc zone, which included all of its former colonies in Africa. The franc zone meant that African countries were required to maintain a fixed exchange rate with the French franc, and they weren't allowed to devalue their currencies without the approval of the French government. The current fiscal policy of the CFA franc system is very much controversial. African central banks hold their foreign exchange reserves in operations accounts held at the French treasury, which effectively places them at France's disposal. Furthermore, the CFA franc member states are obligated to pay interest to each French treasury when their accounts are in debit, which means that the member states effectively pay France to use their own money, which has been criticized as a form of modern-day colonialism. Critics argue that this fiscal policy is a major obstacle to the economic development in the CFA franc member states. They argue that the requirement to deposit half of their exchange reserves at the French treasury limits their ability to invest in their own economies, and that the obligation to pay interest to the French treasury reduces their fiscal autonomy. Despite these criticisms, France has defended the CFA franc system, arguing that it provides stability to the member states' economies and helps prevent inflation. In recent years, there have been some moves towards reforming the system, such as the establishment of a new currency, the eco, to replace the CFA franc in the Western African states. However, the eco is still tied to the euro, and the underlying fiscal policy remains largely unchanged. France also maintained its neo-colonial empire by ensuring that the CFA franc remained the official currency in its former colonies. This allowed France to continue controlling the money supply and maintain economic ties with its former colonies. Additionally, France maintained military bases in several African countries, further solidifying its neo-colonial influence. Countries have tried to abandon the CFA franc currency system. One example of a country that rejected the CFA franc was Guinea, under the leadership of Sékou Touré. Guinea refused to adopt the CFA franc, instead choosing to recreate its own currency. France responded by cutting off aid and imposing economic sanctions on Guinea, leading to economic hardship for the country. The CFA franc currency also allows French companies to gain a strong foothold in Africa. The companies range from small to large, and they operate in various sectors, including agriculture, mining, telecommunications, and banking. Some of the major French multinationals operating in Africa include Total, Orange, Bolloré, and Société Générale. The French government has been accused of using its control over the CFA franc currency and its political influence in African countries to promote the interests of French businesses. In return, these businesses provide access to strategic resources like crude oil, uranium, and iron ore. One example of French control over strategic resources in Africa is the uranium mining industry in Niger. Niger is one of the world's largest producers of uranium, and the French nuclear energy company Areva has been the major player in the industry for decades. The country has been accused of exploiting Niger's uranium resources at the expense of the country's economic development and environmental health. French companies also have a strong presence in the agricultural sector in Africa. French agribusiness companies such as Louis Dreyfus and Bolloré operate large-scale plantations in several African countries, including Ivory Coast, Cameroon, and Senegal. Lastly, French businesses have significant control over West Africa's major ports. The ports of Abidjan in Ivory Coast, Dakar in Senegal, and Lomé in Togo are all operated by Bolloré, a French multinational conglomerate. In conclusion, the CFA franc currency system has been a key tool for France's control over its former African colonies for a long time now. So, what are your thoughts about this currency system? Do you think it's a form of neo-colonialism? Share it with us in the comment section below. And that's about it for today. So, if you liked the video, please subscribe to The Seeker's Edge. We've also made an interesting video about how a Chinese company is secretly taking over the world. You probably would like that one as well if you made it all the way to the end of this one, I'm just saying. Anyways, please give it a watch, and until next time.